this project, or this study, is part of a larger project about the Forge, this online discussion site. And just a quick show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the Forge? So only a few, so I'll try to explain at greater length than with an audience that will be more familiar. So this is a discourse analysis of a panel, much like this one, that took place in 2010 at an Italian game conference called Internascon, where on my right, your left, Tobias Rigstad, one of the founders of the Jeepform game design school, was on a panel with Ron Edwards, the co-founder and chief moderator of The Forge, a game design discussion site for indie tabletop role-playing games. And many people saw parallels between their approaches to game design, but also some differences. And so the woman in the middle is Claudia Cangini, the translator, who's translating to and from Italian the English that the panelists were speaking for an audience of Italian role-playing games. And so if you've watched these 13 6 to 10 minute video clips that are the panel, and that are the data for this study, you'll find that back and forth translation makes this one, an interesting moment of cross-cultural encounter, but also kind of difficult to get through. Many people, in talking about it on discussion sites later, said, "Oh, I just couldn't get through it. I just couldn't get through it because of the back and forth of the translation, and it was just awful." And so, but I found it really fascinating, really interesting for what it said about, or how it sort of spoke to this moment of not just a cross-cultural encounter between national identities, but also a cross-cultural encounter between gaming communities. And we all know that role-playing, as we just talked about, is so multifaceted a thing, to have this moment where two sort of spokespersons or advocates for particular communities of play are talking about their perspective, their history, their origins. That's something interesting about the discourse of games can emerge from that. So,
just hit space.
Voila. So, what I want to do, or what I tried to do in looking at this moment of encounter, right? This hour-long, hour-and-a-half-long panel, is figure out what were the stories in it. What were the things that each participant on the panel was trying to say. And so, in order to do that, I used Kenneth Burke, the rhetorician, his model of rhetoric known as the dramatistic pentad, and I recognize that. Wait, is anyone here a rhetorician? More or less. All right.
I've read Kenneth Burke.
So you read some Burke, right? And it's dense, and I have a tough time explaining it to my students. I think recently I had a success where I was explaining the pentad to my students, and I messed up. I didn't realize that this slide, which is the audience for that panel looking back at you, was here, right? And so, so there's an interesting sort of meta thing that's occurring where, but I need to say that in addition to watching the video, I talked to one of the panelists as part of this larger project about the Forge, briefly about this particular incident. I haven't had the opportunity yet to talk to Tobias Rigstad, but our schedules just haven't sort of coincided, but I do intend, before publishing this in any form, to sort of incorporate his perspective as well. So the pentad. So Kenneth Burke alters an alternative to sort of the traditional rhetorical understanding of what's occurring in speech. I'm sure if you've taken a public speaking class, you've heard logos, ethos, pathos as the three, persuasive proofs, all going all the way back to Aristotle. Burke argues that, well, maybe there's something different going on, or we can understand what's going on a little bit differently in sort of trying to understand what people are doing in speech. And that is, maybe they're offering us a world to share. Maybe they are offering their understanding of something and offering that to us in a way that we're invited to identify with it. And so in looking at that, looking at speech in that way, right? He says, well, you know, we can identify these 5 key elements that emerge when we pay close attention to what people say. The act, the agent, the agency, the scene, and the purpose. The act being what occurs, the agent being who is the author of that act, the agency what means they have at their disposal, the scene where it takes place, and the purpose to what ends. And so the book where he sort of elaborates on this is called The Grammar of Motives, and it's called The Grammar of Motives because, he argues, right, in listening to others, we impute motive to it. That's just one of the fundamental things that we do, right? We make sense of what's happening around us, and you know, one of the reasons, this is Burke, this is not me, one of the reasons we believe in God is because we're imputing motives to things, right? And actually, you've heard some evolutionary psychologists maybe talk about enough, never mind, right? Well, let's not go there, right? But, and Burke scholars argue whether, well, did Burke intend this ontically, that is, as to sort of describe what things, you know, how things really are, like is the world composed of this stuff, or is this merely epistemic, right, in the sense that it's how we know about things? Again, we don't need to go down that route either. They're interesting to think about, to talk about, but for our purposes, or for my purposes, what's useful and interesting about applying the Burkean pentad to this discourse, this particular exchange, and this particular encounter, is how it lets us see the multiple levels at which the encounter is taking place, right? And so I'm going to talk about, in applying the pentad, right, talk about at the level of the exigence, that is what's occurring as an event, what is this thing, at the level of performance, that is what is each participant on the panel trying to achieve or seemingly trying to achieve, and then finally at the narrative level. What's the story, what are the stories that each one is telling about the world that they came from that brings them to this panel, right? That said, let me just sort of drive on. I should say, right, that in identifying particular elements of the pentad or particular elements of this encounter as interesting to examine, right? The concept, the Burkean concept that needs explanation is the notion of ratios. And so he argues, well, okay, you have these 5 elements, these 5 key components that occur that you can identify when listening to what others say. And in any given description or redescription of a speech or an utterance via the pentad, certain relationships, certain ratios, certain of the elements will resonate more strongly. I think of them as like strings that you pluck. That pentad is that pentacular pentad, right? The pentacle, you know, so that each pairwise combination of elements is potentially resonant in the sense that it is potentially problematic and opens up the narrative that's being told to challenge. It's the thing that needs to be nailed down the most in order for us to be convinced by or to identify with what the speaker is saying. So at the highest level, what I'll call the level of exigence or the level of the event, like we can think about the panel as a thing that occurs and that can be examined at the pentadic level, right? And so in this case, the act is this the dialogue or engaging in dialogue or discussion about games. The scene, the panel that they're on at this Italian gaming convention, but the agents, Ron and Tobias, Edwards and Rigsdad, and their purpose being, you know, to engage in this discussion. And so, in terms of identifying, you know, what seems to be important, right, is this notion that clearly what matters is the agents, right, the actors. It's Edwards and Tobias as the sort of representatives or advocates of particular gaming communities, and their agency, the instruments or the means that they are using to, to do that advocacy. And interestingly, right, how they frame it is as their the experiences that they bring, and that's not just within the within the panel itself, but also in what you might call the paratextual elements, like the guest of honor bios on the Internascon website, where they're identified as special people within this setting. And at one point during the talk, Edwards even makes that clear by saying, oh look, the camera is pointed at us, not at you. And so when Tobias, yeah, oh, 5 minutes left? Oh, God. All right, so at the level of what's occurring at an event, you have two advocates for their different communities speaking to an audience of Italian gamers who, it should be noted, are more familiar with indie games of the sort that Edwards espouses on the Forge than they are with Jeepform, the kinds of games that Rikstad is advocating for. And so so even though there is this sort of foreignness, there's also cultural alignment on the level of what games are more familiar to the audience. But moving forward, so I clearly don't have time to talk about the respective histories of Edwards and Rikstad, but I just want to note that as the co-founder of the Forge, Edwards is associated with both particular theories or models of game design oriented around the concept of system does matter, but also advocating for independent game production, creation, publication, right? And so the notion that these games need to be created, a wide variety of games need to be created, is part of the sort of the motivation underlying Edwards' contribution. And Rikstad, on the other hand, is the founding member of the Viaker Jeep, I don't know, the Jeepform play collective, which advocated for a very tightly focused style of play that was invested in creating psychological impacts on players as part of the sort of design objectives. But moving forward, we can see, right, at the level of performance, Edwards being like really closely focused on engaging in dialogue with the audience, and that's, to a certain degree, that's understandable because of the extent to which they were familiar with his games. He could talk to them, and he felt that he could engage with them. And a audience member at the panel said his recollection was that, well, Edwards was happy all weekend because people were familiar with the ideas that he'd been talking about for many years, but not having to explain, from the beginning, everything that he was talking about was very agreeable, right? And you can imagine Rikstad having the opposite experience, right? Coming and having to explain from scratch, ab initio, if you like, the ideas that he was talking about and made things a little more for him. I mentioned that, on the slide here, it mentions that the agency that Edwards employs is sophistic communication, which is a style oriented towards accommodation, right? He's interested in, there are many times where he will back off from claims that he was making or things that he was offering in order to make some sort of accommodating kinds of gestures or movements. But fundamentally, he was interested in defending the claim that system does matter, right? That was the essence of his contribution to the role-playing game discourse. In contrast, right, Edwards, Rikstad describes what he did. There's a video where called One Cool Thing, right? Many conventions have them, where someone will take a camera and they'll go around and say, one cool thing that happened at this convention was, and interestingly, what Rikstad said was something like, oh, one cool thing that I saw was not, battling or agreeing with Ron Edwards, right? Speaking to the expectations about confrontation that weren't necessarily met, but was instead playing an Italian indie game called Sign Requiem, which was like an Italian post-apocalyptic zombie game. And so Brigstad's understanding of his place there seems to be like immersed in or emerging from the fact that he's a stranger there, right? Much more so than Edwards. That he came there, played some games that he thought were nice, tightly focused designs in line with his aesthetic, and so he concludes by saying, "Well, I'll be back," right? But the notion is that as an agent, he's here present in this foreign site and is visiting it. Moving from the level of performance, right, the two different performances, to the level of the narratives that each one told. In Edwards' talk, right, in Edwards' story, he talks about how in the role-playing discourse of the 1990s, offering the idea that system does matter proved to be controversial, right? It proved to be something that challenged the views that people had. And ultimately, though, the reason why he did that, right, was in order to bring about larger dialogue, right, bigger dialogue. I know I'm out of time, but let me just finish up, right? The creating or restoring the vibrancy of like the pre-1980 game discourse and game design, like game designs, like bring about more varied, more interesting game designs was sort of the vision that he had. In contrast, Brigstad's sort of sense was that, or what emerged from Brigstad's talk is the idea that, well, what we want to do is encourage tight, focused designs. That's what's important, and that's what I'm here to do. So again, there's a lot that I'm glossing over, and I need to close. So I will, but just by saying that what the Pentat does is let us focus at different levels of a larger discourse and identify within it elements that are of interest. So it serves as kind of this heuristic function, pointing our attention to things that are valuable and worth seeing. In terms of examining this particular scene or site, what's interesting or valuable about it is the extent to which it reveals differences in the way that designers and people discussing it understand what it means to play games. Thank you very much.